Hello and welcome to this fifth video and final video in this series on how I made my wedding dress. I have taken it out and gotten it all ready, so I'm excited to show that to you. And if you are patient, after I show you how I made the dress and all the finishing touches, I will show you a little clip of our wedding as well. So stay tuned. Where we left off, I had just finished finally attaching the skirt to the bodice and then figuring out some of the fit problems, such as not being able to zip up the side zip and then having some gaping in the bodice. And so I fixed it. I showed you in my last video, which I'll link here, how I fixed that. And in the end, I think that the modifications I made were pretty subtle. It didn't show too much that I had vastly modified the pattern to get it to fit me correctly. And I was very happy with that. So this video is all about the finishing touches that I put on the dress before the big day, and that included finishing the structural elements to get it to hang correctly so that I could level the hem. I had a friend coming over about 2 weeks before the wedding to spend an entire day with me helping me level out all 7 layers of tulle, which I will go over how we did that because it was a bit complicated, and then how I did all the finishing touches, such as adding a bustle to the train of the skirt and then also a wrist loop so that I had different ways of picking it up off the floor during the evening when I wanted to dance and move around a little bit more freely, and then any of the little tiny details that I finished just to get it just right as much as possible, and then how I made my wedding veil, which I sewed until the morning of the event. But I will get to all of that, and let's jump right in. To get the structure ready for when my friend was going to come over to help me level the hem, I first attached the lining to the dress along the inner waistband, folding the seam allowance of the lining in and then matching that edge to the outer fabric waist seam on the inside, then sewing the two together with a pick stitch by hand, very carefully, and sewing just into the seam allowance of the tulle layers of the skirt, and making sure that the needle did not poke through to the outside of the garment so that these stitches would be invisible. And then I sewed the lining down by hand to the edge of the zipper tape to get it as close as possible and as precisely as possible. And this is something I actually kind of enjoy. So if there wasn't the stressful element of having to finish it in 2 weeks, I think I would have taken a lot more enjoyment out of this part. So now I invite you down to the floor with me because I didn't actually get this part filmed while I was doing it. And I'd like to show you this now because this was actually a big question for me. So the last part before I leveled the hem of the tulle was to attach the left side seam underneath the zip, and there were 2 options available. There was either sewing all of the tulle together in one seam down to the bottom, or I could sew each layer of the tulle separately down to the bottom, and I wasn't sure which one to do and which would make most sense. And at first I thought it would be better to sew each layer of the tulle separately so that I had the same amount of movement, or the maximum amount of movement in the skirt as possible, and so I did that. But there was a massive lump at the bottom of the zip, which is right here, of all of those tulle fabrics kind of lumping over and then piling up on top of each other with the seam allowances, because tulle seam allowances, no matter how much you press it or clip it, it kind of does what it wants. It kind of just like hangs openly, and it's very difficult to control. And so in the end, I ended up unpicking all 7 of those seams and then carefully lining up each layer of tulle, each edge, so that all 7 were together, basting them together because they're very slippery and they don't stay together, and then sewing them together down all the way to the hem. And so there still is a little bit of a lump, and you can see the seam allowance because it's just like one block of seam allowance. So it's a little bit bulkier than I would have liked, but the lump here at the bottom of the zipper base is much less visible than it was when they were all sewed together separately. I do not know how I could have avoided that otherwise. So that is my solution for the side seam underneath a zipper. And then the last step before this dress was ready for the hem to be leveled was to add in the bust cups, just in case it influenced a little bit the way it hung. So I just added it exactly, placing the middle where it was supposed to be as it was marked on the front bodice from the beginning, and I attached just the top and the bottom to that area just in case, because I didn't want it pulling too much from the front of the bodice. And so I just used some waxed thread that I double threaded through my needle, and I stitched the top and the bottom part of it here, and it went in pretty easy, and then it was ready to be leveled. And then my friend came over. It was time to level the hem, and I am forever in her debt because she spent an entire day, at least 8 hours, on the floor marking and cutting the hem for me because I couldn't do it myself. I had to let it hang naturally, standing up straight and in the shoes that I was going to wear on the day, and not move. And so I couldn't bend down and mark it myself, and I didn't want to ask my fiance to do it because I wanted it to be a surprise for him. So she came over and she helped me with that, and that was an immense aid. I am so grateful to have her as a friend. So hemming tulle is easy and difficult at the same time in that you don't need to actually hem it. You just cut it and you leave the edge raw, but you do need to make sure that it's hanging correctly. And so we did spend a lot of time just smoothing down the layers and making sure that the front was hanging straight, the sides were hanging straight, the back was well out of the way. So we tried to cut the tulle as close as possible to the floor, just above, and as straight as possible to the floor, just so that it would lightly graze the floor and hang a little bit above it. And I was a little bit worried that the tulle would spring up once cut, but it didn't actually do that at all, and I was very happy to see that. So what we did was we made sure all of the points in the front and side that we had pinned were staying nice and straight, and then Rachel marked all around the front and sides where it touched the ground and then cut, and we went layer by layer, starting with the lining and then the innermost layer of tulle, working out to the 7th outer layer of tulle. And yes, that took all day. And then for the train, because it's supposed to hang on the ground, what we did was we graded that line from the front towards the side and then gradually graded out to the back of the train so that it would be a gradual line and not a step from where it was in the front just touching the ground to the train where it dragged in the ground. And that was also a bit complicated to do to make sure that the line was smooth and that it corresponded through all the layers. Once all of the layers were leveled at the hem, I could add the finishing touches to the lining, including hemming the lining and finishing the seam allowances. For the seam allowances, with the center back seam and the right side seam, I was able to sew them with French seams, with the seam allowances enclosed within the seam. But since the zip was placed along the left side seam, I wasn't able to sew a French seam, so I just sewed the lining right sides together from the base of the zip to the hem, and then pressed the seam allowances open and hand stitched the edges of the seam allowances down with a catch stitch to keep them flat. And then for the hem of the lining, I sewed a tiny rolled hem all the way around. Once I finished with the lining, I was able to concentrate on the final finishing details, such as the bustle and a wrist loop to manage the train. For notions, I had a buttonhole braid for the bustle and 5 buttons, and then a ribbon for the wrist loop. The hardest part of installing both was finding the center back of the tulle, because tulle is so very slippery. It was very, very hard to figure out if they were laying correctly, and the only indication that I had found the center back was there was a very, very faint fold line where the fabric was originally folded on the bolt because it was cut on the fold. And so that was my center back line. I had to work only in daylight because only with the light shining a certain way could I see that little fold line. And so I lined those up very carefully and pinned through all the layers to make sure that they stayed together. And then I added the bustle. The buttonhole braid is sewn on the inside to the lining and then through most of the layers of the dress, perhaps like the first 5 layers and not all of them, so that it's nice and stable. And I had sewn the 2 back skirts of the lining together with a French seam, so it was nice and strong, and I was very confident that it would stay in place. I still used wax thread and double threaded it through my needle so that it would be nice and sturdy. And then for where to put it on the dress, Camille, the pattern maker who helped me design this dress, recommended 40 centimeters down from the waist, but I think that really depends on how tall you are and how long your skirts are. And so I spent some time moving it around, figuring it out, because at first when I installed it there, I had sort of a gap in the back when I bustled the skirts. There was my calves open to the air. So I moved it around until I got it exactly where, when the skirts were folded up into the bustle, that the fold would be only about 1 centimeter or 2 above the floor. For me, the buttonhole braid for the bustle was about 65 centimeters down from the waist seam. And then I stitched 5 buttons that I found that would fit the buttonhole braid along the hemline through all of the layers of the dress, including the lining. So 1 in the back and then 2 on the sides, evenly spaced between the side seam and the back button. And so then when you button it up, you kind of crisscross them and they sort of bustle up into the bottom, like underneath the skirt into the bottom. And then for the wrist loop, it was pretty easy. I just had a piece of ribbon and I measured it to my wrists. I ended up sewing a little bit too tight, so I recommend allowing a little bit of ease so that it's easy to put it on and off. And I sewed that 20 centimeters up from the hem to the lining layer and through all of the layers. And it was actually very practical as well. So then on the hanger, when I was transporting the dress or hanging it up for storage, I could just loop the train over the top of the hanger and keep it out of the way and not dragging on the floor, because tulle picks up everything. And then the very last detail was that I found that the lining hung a little bit closer to my legs than the tulle did. But what I did was I attached the lining to the hem of the tulle and stitched just to the bottom layer to kind of attach the lining to the hem somehow, so that it was kind of away from my legs and wouldn't get tangled up in my legs while I was walking. And that was very effective, and I highly recommend that as well if you notice that going on with your dress. So then the final step before this dress was finished was to sew the pleats down a little bit, just shape them a little bit across the front bodice here, because I wanted them to be a little bit smaller, and I wanted them to follow sort of the shape of the bodice versus just kind of popping out. But to do this, what I did was I sat in front of a mirror with the dress on, and then without poking myself with the pins, I shaped the pleats with my fingers just across the bodice where I wanted them to go, and then I pinned them in place in a few different areas so that I could then lay the dress out and stitch them all down. And I actually very much enjoyed this process. I knew that it was the last part of the project and that after that the dress was done, and I had become so attached to this dress and this project that the end sort of, I didn't mourn it, but I had gotten so used to working on it I couldn't imagine working on anything else. So I took my time with this. I knew I had 5 days left until the wedding, and I actually enjoyed this a lot more than I thought I would. So once I had pinned those down to my satisfaction, I laid the dress out on my working table, and then with a waxed piece of thread single looped through my needle, I sewed those down with stitches that did catch a little bit of the tulle on the outside of the bodice, but then that tied and knotted at the inside in the lining, and so that it would be almost invisible and hold those pleats down in the shaping that I wanted them to be. And then for the back, because I couldn't pin it while wearing it, because I'm not that flexible, I used my tailoring ham that I usually use for pressing garments to lay the back pieces, the little petals that overlap, over the ham so that it wasn't totally flat but a little bit rounded. And then I shaped the gathers that way with my fingers on the table and then sewed those down as well. And then the dress was finished and it was ready for the big day. But wait, once the dress was finished, I still had my veil to make. So I actually learned how to make this veil from an online class by Camille Saint-Léger, who is the same person who helped me design my dress and then drafted the pattern and then helped me with any questions that I had when I was making it. She also has 2 online classes on how to make your own wedding dress and how to make your own wedding veil in French on the French website for online classes and crafting called Artisan. I will link it here below if you'd like to check that out. But it was full of a lot of really interesting information on how to make all kinds of veils. I chose to make the chapelle veil, which is like a chapel length veil, I guess. And I wanted it to hang around my arms. So you draft an oval, and you can have the oval, the top part of the oval sitting on your head. Let me put it here, you can see it on your head here, or you can flip it and place the comb a little bit further down so that it hangs, it flips over this way and it hangs around your arms at the length that you want. To figure out the length, I measured from the back of my head where I wanted the comb to sit, down to the floor and then past the train of the dress, and I wanted it to be about 1 meter longer than the train of the dress, and so that's what I did, and it did end up being larger. And then what I did was, using the pattern of the back skirt of my dress, I made sure that the veil sort of followed the shape of the back skirt in the train, but a little bit outside, hanging a little bit further away to kind of increase the volume of the train. And I was very happy with the way it turned out. So then the lace I picked is from Stragier, which is a Belgian fabric shop that specializes in wedding fabrics, and that's where I got most of the other fabrics for this dress. I will link it below if you're interested in checking out this lace as well, but it was a double-sided lace when I bought it, and what I did was I cut it out along the shape of the lace, and this is something you can watch me do a little bit during a previous video that I filmed right before the wedding called Sewing Chats, I think, Wedding Edition, where I answered your questions about my wedding while cutting out this lace. I love this lace because it's a Chantilly lace, and it's got these little eyelashes and a little bit more of a floral design. And what I did to lay the lace on the tulle, if I can show you here, the lace is positioned so that the bottom edge of the scallop is hanging just a bit over or on the edge of the tulle here. This is the wrong side facing you, and so that the eyelashes are free. And then what I did was I basted along the edge here with some blue thread, just in case some of the fibers stayed in the tulle, because I like that sort of tradition for good luck in weddings. And then once I had basted the entire thing, what I did was for the bottom hem, I basted as far as I could go along the bottom. And then for the top, I added the lace just to where it sort of folds over into the rest of the veil. And I had enough for both. The edges are like this. It just kind of stops right there like that, but I think it's okay like that. And I had enough, I had perfectly enough that I had the exact amount that I wanted, and I spent a lot of time putting teeny tiny invisible stitches right along here to fix the lace down to the tulle. And I worked on this up until the very last minute. So at home, I worked on it watching Gilmore Girls to calm me down and stitching very carefully on the last few days before the wedding. And then I stitched it in the car on the way to the north of France where we're getting married. And then I even stitched it up until the very morning of the wedding. And then I had just enough time for my friends and family to help me do a final press. It was a 3-person affair, but I'm really happy with the way it turned out in the end. And then everything was ready for the big day. So to conclude this series, I wanted to show you a clip from the wedding day itself. And with great pleasure, I wanted to share this moment with you because I know that some of you have been following from the very beginning, or even if you're new, a lot of you have been encouraging me throughout this process, and I greatly appreciate it. So I'm happy to share that with you now. I hope that this series, if you are planning on embarking on a big project like this one, I hope that the series was of help to you. And brought you information because that was very important to me. If you enjoyed this series, don't hesitate to like it and subscribe to this channel. I do plan on having lots of interesting future projects, even though a wedding dress is probably not going to be one of them anytime soon. If you are planning on embarking on a big project like this one, I wish you all the best.